And welcome, Mindsetters, to this session of Learn Extra Live for grade 10s. We're going to be doing life science today, and here I've got Eugen with me today, who's going to be taking us today's session. So, what are we doing today, Eugen?
So we're continuing with environmental studies,
Alright.
and we're looking at the abiotic components today.
All right, awesome. So, while Eugen makes his way across the board, I'm going to tell the Mindsetters, by now, you should know the drill. You need to get on the page www.facebook.com/learn extra and get chatting to me. Let me know what's wrong. If you're lost and if you need help, make sure that you get on the page and tell me what you guys are thinking. But on that note, this is where I hand over to Eugen, who's going to continue the show. Take it away.
Thanks, Ty. Guys, welcome. Let's continue with ecology. To recap what we've done in the last 2 weeks, last week we looked at the abiotic factors in an ecosystem. During the first week, we looked at the biosphere and the various components. Today we're looking at the biotic factors, and we're going to spend some time looking at how they influence the environment. So let's get onto the smartboard. Right. So let's look at the concept of ecology. Again, we're revising the term ecology, and if you remember from the first 2 episodes that we've done already, ecology refers to the interaction between the living and the non-living components in the environment and with the environment itself. So that's a very important definition that we must always remember, and it often comes in your exams and your tests. So learn that, guys. Last week we looked at the abiotic components in an ecosystem, and just to recap again, we said that the abiotic components refer to the non-living components in an ecosystem, and these included the soil, the climate, temperature, sunlight, and water. And we said that the abiotic components have a significant impact on the living organisms in an ecosystem. Today we focus on the biotic components, and if we look at the biotic components, the word biotic refers to living organisms. So when we study ecology and we refer to the biotic components, we refer to the living organisms in an ecosystem. So if we focus on the important words, it's living organisms form the biotic components of an ecosystem. Let's look at the different components that form the biotic components. In an ecosystem, the biotic components are the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers. We've mentioned these terms when we did the nutrient cycles. We've mentioned these terms when we looked at the biosphere. Today we're going to look at these terms in relation to the biotic components. Let's look at producers firstly. And we've heard this word before, producers, and obviously producers mean organisms that are capable of producing their own food. And this is often plants, and they can only do that by the process of photosynthesis. So when we talk about producers, we refer to plants or organisms that can photosynthesize or use the radiant energy from the sun and convert that into chemical energy. These organisms are known as the autotrophs. Auto is broken up into 2 words. Auto meaning self, and trophs refer to their trophic level. So these organisms are capable of manufacturing food by themselves. Any organism that cannot manufacture its own food is referred to as a heterotroph, or they're also known as consumers. So we can broadly classify the biotic components into 2 groups, the autotrophs and the heterotrophs, or we can call them the producers and the consumers. Let's look at the producers or the autotrophs in further detail. All living organisms need energy, and that energy comes indirectly from the sun. Autotrophs are capable of utilizing radiant energy and converting that into chemical energy by the process photosynthesis. So we said that all living organisms need energy to perform their life processes. And these organisms will get their energy from the sun. Green plants are all capable of photosynthesizing, and hence they can convert radiant energy from the sun into chemical energy, which we know as glucose or starch. Okay, and these are stored in the plant, which subsequently feeds other organisms in an ecosystem. So we know that The pigment that makes plants green is chlorophyll, and that is what traps the radiant energy or the sunlight, and by the process known as photosynthesis converts it into chemical energy or starch. Examples of some of the autotrophs are plants, the trees that we see around us, shrubs, bushes, moss plants, as well as algae. And these are the aquatic plants that are capable of photosynthesizing in water. Okay, let's look at the heterotrophs next. So we looked at autotrophs and we said that autotrophs were capable of manufacturing their own food, and for them to do that they need to have chlorophyll. When we talk of heterotrophs, we refer to organisms that are not capable of manufacturing their own food. These organisms will rely on other organisms for their energy. Let's look at them in detail. So animals that are not able to manufacture their own food will get their energy from the food they eat. And we all rely on food for our energy. Unfortunately, we unlike plants, we cannot absorb the sunlight and manufacture energy, and hence we need to get our energy from an organism that produces food. So we all rely on plants directly or indirectly for our food. So these organisms are also known as the consumers, because these are the ones that consume the energy or consume the producers. The autotrophs provide a source of food for the consumers. When we look at the consumers, we can classify them into three groups. And we've heard these terms before, but we're going to spend some time looking at them in detail. So we can classify them into three groups: herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Okay. Right. Let's look at herbivores in detail. So herbivores form the first group of consumers. Herbivores would exclusively eat plant material or plant matter. They are also known as the primary consumers. Primary because these refer to the organisms that are the ones that eat plants, and hence they are the primary consumers, and hence form the first level in an ecosystem. And if you think about some examples of our primary consumers, and we'd see that these organisms need large amounts of food to satisfy their hunger, as plants contain lots of water, it contains cellulose, and this has very little nutritional value. And hence, these organisms would tend to feed a lot and eat a lot of food to satisfy their nutritional needs. So these organisms would have had long digestive tracts to digest their food. And if we think of some of the herbivores, for example, a cow, and you remember that food goes through at least 4 compartments in their stomachs so that it completes the process of digestion, and that could take up to 12 hours. So the nutritional value in the plant material is very low, and hence your consumers, your primary consumers or your herbivores tend to eat large amounts of plant material to sustain their energy requirements. Okay. The next group of consumers are the carnivores, and we're all familiar with the term carnivores. Carnivores refer to flesh eaters, organisms that would eat other animals or feed off meat exclusively. These organisms feed on the primary consumers. They rely on the primary consumers. The primary consumers would be the organisms that feed off plants, and they acquire the energy, they grow, and they store their energy in their body, in their meat, in their muscle. Your carnivores would feed off the primary consumers to sustain their energy requirements. When we look at the primary consumers, we refer to them as organisms that are the ones that are feeding off the plants. Our secondary consumers would be the carnivores. These are the secondary consumers, as they are in order of development. These are the organisms that are the ones that feed off the herbivores. When we look at our carnivores, they have a short digestive tract, and the simple reason behind this is that the food that they eat has a high nutritional value, higher than plant material, and hence they do not need to eat as much as herbivores do, so that they can sustain themselves. Okay, so if we look at some examples of our carnivores, we know that there are many insects that are carnivorous, there are birds that are carnivores, reptiles that feed off exclusively meat, there are fish as well, and many mammals that are capable of that eat exclusively meat. And this is one classical example that we all know of, and we wouldn't mess around with the lions when we get out into the wild. The third group of our consumers or heterotrophs are the omnivores. And we all probably have referred to this term at some stage. Some of the secondary consumers eat both plant and animal matter, and hence we refer to an organism that consumes both plant material and animal material or meat as a omnivore. These organisms are known as omnivores because they're capable of eating both plant and animal matter. Example of omnivores, a classical example is man, and I know most of us do eat our veggies, and that's very important, but you get animals as well that rely on vegetables to sustain their nutritional value, pigs and monkeys. So why is it important to have plant material in our diet? If you think about the bran flakes that we have in the morning, it's got lots of fiber, and that fiber is very nutritional. It helps in the process of digestion, it helps bulk to the intestine, and that prevents us from developing stomach aches and constipation. So we need lots of fiber in our diet, and as much as it's important to have meat, we also need to be conscious about the plant material that we have in our diet. It helps us to be healthy. The next thing we look at is, in an ecosystem, we look at energy flow. And remember that energy is passed on from one organism to the next. So in an ecosystem, energy is passed on from one level to the next level. Often, the secondary consumers are a source of food to the other organisms. And in turn, the organisms that feed on the secondary consumers are known as the tertiary consumers. So we have the primary consumers, we have the secondary consumers, and we have the tertiary consumers. Some examples of tertiary consumers would be owls, hawks, lions, and cheetahs. On the next few slides, we can look at some food chains, and we can look at some of these tertiary consumers and how they interact in an ecosystem. Some consumers are also referred to as predators, they're referred to as scavengers. So let's look at what's the difference between a predator and a scavenger. So we know that many animals hunt, and they need to hunt for their food, and that process of hunting is essentially important for them to survive. So animals that hunt for their food are called predators. The examples of predators are the jackals, the owls, yes, lions, lizards, and even spiders, as they will set traps, they will spin their webs and catch other insects, and hence we refer to these as predators. The animals that predators feed on are known as prey, and we know that we often refer to the term as I do not want to fall prey to somebody's prank, and that is where the term prey comes from. Prey refers to the organism that predators would feed on. Okay. The relationship that exists between a prey and a predator is referred to as the prey-predator relationship. And we often will come across this term as we get into grade 11 and 12. When we look at ecology in further detail, we need to understand the relationship between a prey and a predator. The next group of consumers are scavengers. And we've heard of scavengers before. Scavengers basically refer to organisms that feed off the dead prey or the leftovers that predators have left. So your scavengers would be organisms that would feed off dead carcasses, the remains of other organisms that have been left behind by the predators. Examples of some of the scavengers are the jackals, the hyenas, vultures, and even ants. Ants would feed off the remains of other organisms as well. And most important, and we've discussed this before, the decomposers. So what happens when organisms die? They lie around, they eventually decay, and we don't see them after a little while. What causes them to decay? Yes, decomposers. So when animals and plants die, their body decays. And that process of decaying is facilitated or is helped by organisms known as decomposers. So we have many different types of decomposers, but we're going to do a few today. Bacteria and fungi are two examples of decomposers that are capable of breaking down dead plant and animal remains using enzymes. We all have enzymes in our body that have specific functions, and many of these enzymes assist us in digestion. So bacteria and fungi play an important role in the decomposition of organic matter or dead plants and animals using enzymes. We could also refer to decomposers as saprophytes. Now, what does the term saprophyte refer to? So we looked at organisms that are capable of photosynthesizing. We refer to them as autotrophs. Your saprophytes are organisms that cannot manufacture their food but rely on dead decaying material to sustain their nutritional needs. And hence we refer to decomposers as saprophytes. So essentially, a fungus would be a saprophyte. So these organisms, saprophytes, will not be able to break down, manufacture their food, and they rely on organic material for their nutritional. And they break them down into simple inorganic materials that then returns back into their soil. Okay. Let's look at why decomposers are important. During the first few episodes, we looked at the nutrient cycle, and if we look at this nutrient cycle, we see that your decomposers play an important role throughout the ecosystem. They will help to convert producers back into, they will help to decompose producers that are, so the dead dried plants will be decomposed. Also the consumers would be broken down by, we can see that the consumers and the producers both are broken down or decayed via the decomposers, and those inorganic nutrients then return back into the soil to replenish the soil with its nutritional needs. Okay, so we've gone through the different types of organisms in the biotic components. Now we're going to look at the flow of energy in an ecosystem and how energy is passed on from your producers right up to your tertiary consumers. Right. So if we recap and if we look at producers, they rely on radiant energy from the sun, and they're capable of producing food by a process known as photosynthesis. This energy will then be consumed by your consumers. The consumers we looked at now were your herbivores. And in turn, herbivores would be consumed by other carnivores, and eventually decomposer would have an impact on all of these organisms, and thus returning the nitrates, the nutrients, back into the soil. Okay. So how do we study energy through an ecosystem? We look at food chains, and we've heard the term food chains before, but let's look at food chains in detail. So let's see what the definition of a food chain is. So food chains will illustrate to us how energy in an ecosystem will flow from one organism to the next. And essentially that is what it shows us. It shows us how the energy is passed on from one organism to the next. If we look at a food chain, it is a set of flow diagrams that shows organisms eating other organisms and in turn being eaten by themselves. And that is how energy is passed on from one level to the next. The position of an organism in an ecosystem is referred to as its trophic level. So we're going to refer to the terms trophic levels in the next few slides. When we refer to the first trophic level, we refer to the organism right at the bottom, and subsequent levels would refer to organisms further up in the food chain. Okay, let's look at some examples of food chains.
Thinking before, sorry to jump in there, but I was thinking before we start getting into the food chains, we might want to take a little bit of a break. Because I'm thinking it's a lot of information.
Okay, that's
That's
a good idea, Ty. Let's go for a short break, guys. And when we get back, we're going to look at some of these examples. And maybe you guys can look at these slides posted up by Ty, and we can get some questions from you guys.
All right, so on that note, Mindsetters, I will be posting up these notes, so make sure that you guys get on the page and let me know what specifically you guys would like me to post. But on that note, we'll see you after this break. And welcome back, Mindsetters. I hope you had a nice little break. You went and did whatever you had to do. You went to go get some water. You went to go answer your phone, whatever. Now what you need to do is put everything else to the side and make sure that you're paying attention. You've got your pens and pads out and you're ready to make notes. Because we can continue, because I'm handing it straight back to Mr. Eugen. Eugen, take it away.
Thanks, Ty. Right, let's look at some of those examples of food chains that we discussed earlier on. Right, so here we have a typical terrestrial food chain. Terrestrial meaning a food chain that we find on land. Okay, a fancy term, terrestrial. So a terrestrial food chain would refer to how the energy would flow from one organism to the next on land. Okay, so when we look at this food chain, we see that we've got our producers. We've got our producers down here, and these are the organisms that provide the energy. They're capable of photosynthesizing. We refer to them as the organisms in the first trophic level, and that is the producers. This energy is then passed on to the mouse, and the mouse is obviously the primary consumer, and we refer to that as the second trophic level. And these are the herbivores. Again, herbivores are organisms that consume plant material, and in turn the energy that the mouse would acquire and store in its body will then be available to the secondary consumer, and the secondary consumer in this case would be a snake, and it would be on the third trophic level. Again, a snake is a carnivore, an organism that feeds exclusively on meat or the flesh of other animals. And then finally we have, on the fourth trophic level, we have the tertiary consumer. In this case is a hawk, and we know that hawks would feed off larger secondary consumers. In this case it would feed off the snake, and hence we see that energy being passed on from the first trophic level to the second trophic, third, and finally to the fourth trophic level. Our decomposers would come in along the food chain at various trophic levels, and they will then be responsible for converting the energy or breaking down the dead organic matter back and returning those nutrients back into the soil. Let's look at another example of a food chain. In this case, we're looking at an aquatic food chain, showing how the energy is passed on in an aquatic ecosystem. We said that plants are capable of photosynthesizing, and in an aquatic ecosystem we have algae. Algae are capable of utilizing radiant energy and converting that into food or glucose, and that in turn would feed your primary consumers. In this case would be herbivorous fish, which form the second trophic level. These would in turn supply energy to larger carnivorous fish, and these would be the third trophic level, and hence we have that energy being stored in a larger fish, which then provides energy for larger organisms high up in the trophic level. What you'd notice in this slide is that, and in the previous slide, is that as we move up a food chain, the size of an organism changes. Here you'd see plants being very small, but as we move further up, the size of the organism increases. Here we find that the herbivorous fish are much smaller than the carnivorous fish, and then we have the hawk, which are obviously much larger than the carnivorous fish, and hence the amount of energy available at the next trophic level would substantially decrease, as much of the energy goes into the life processes of the organisms. Right, let's look at how energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next with another series of diagrams. So energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next. The original source of the energy is radiant energy from the sun, and we looked at that already. In a food chain, the arrows will indicate the direction in which the energy flows. And often energy flows from one organism to the next. And in this diagram, we see the direction of the arrow indicating the flow of energy from one trophic level to the next. What is important to note is that there is always less energy available to organisms higher up on the food chain. And why is this, guys? We tend to consume food. How much of that energy is utilized by us? How much of that energy goes into our body, into building muscle? And if we think about it, not all of it. Lots of that energy is utilized for the normal physiological processes, but we tend to lose lots of energy as heat. We tend to lose lots of energy as waste as well. And hence we say that when energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next, the amount of energy available always decreases, because lots of that energy is given off as heat as well as during excretion. So we say that there's always less energy available to organisms high up the food chain due to the loss of energy at each trophic level. So the initial amount of energy that is available to producers would substantially decrease as we move further up into a food chain. Right. So we've looked at food chains, and if I were to define food chains again, would be the simplest feeding relationship indicating what eats what in an ecosystem. However, in an ecosystem, we know that organisms do not exclusively feed on one type of producer or primary consumer. The reason behind this is that animals in an ecosystem would need to look at alternative energy sources depending on the availability. And hence we see that a food chain does not exist entirely by itself. It would be interlinked with other food chains. And hence, when we see several food chains interlinked and networked together, we refer to that as a food web. Okay, so here's an example of a food web, and we're going to look at that in detail. Okay, so let's look at how energy flows in a food web. So most animals will feed on a variety of food, and hence we said that they do not rely exclusively on one type of food, and they need to have different sources of food available. We know that in an environment, the conditions change, organisms would change, and hence to ensure that they survive, they need to have alternative sources of food. The best way of illustrating this interaction between different food chains is using a food web. Okay, so let's look at, sorry guys, okay, let's look at this food web here. So if we were to define food web, we'd say that food web is a series of interactions or interconnected food chains in an ecosystem that illustrate how energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next. Okay. In this food web, we see several food chains. If I were to highlight some of them, this would indicate one food chain. An alternative food chain would be this here. We could highlight several of these. Okay, we can see energy from a plant to a mouse, and then a jackal feeding on a mouse. And hence, if we look at food chains, many organisms provide a source of food to several other organisms, and hence this interconnectedness is referred to as a food web. Right. So before we get to our questions, we're gonna touch base with what we've done already. I'm going to refer to some of our questions, and I'm also going to take questions from you. So keep those questions coming. Ty's going to chat to me in a while, and he's going to give me some questions. So we've started with biotic components today. We looked at the primary consumers, we looked at the producers, and we looked at the consumers. We said producers were the autotrophs, the consumers were the heterotrophs. We looked at heterotrophs, and we looked at the three different types of heterotrophs: your herbivores, your carnivores, and your omnivores. We looked at decomposers as well. And then we discussed what scavengers were, predators were, and what prey was. We then went on to looking at how energy is passed on in a food chain, and we referred to that movement of energy from one trophic level to the next as a food chain. And then we looked at how food chains are interconnected to give you a food web. Now let's look at some questions that I've prepared for you, and I hope you're going to try and attempt these and I'll get some feedback from you guys. Okay, so here we have a food web, and the first question that I put up is, what do you understand by the term food chain? Now, it's a very simple definition. A food chain refers to the flow of energy from one organism to the next. And that's it. So it refers to the flow of energy from one organism to the next. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. Right. So in any food chain, what do arrows in a food chain represent? Okay. So what do arrows in a food chain represent, guys? Yes, it represents the movement of energy from one trophic level to the next. If we look at this food web, we see that these arrows represent the energy being available from the grass to the rabbit, and in this case, from the rabbit to the hawk. So the arrows will always indicate to us the direction in which energy flows in a food chain or a food web. Okay. The next question. From the above food web, identify one food chain with 4 trophic levels. Let's look at that question again. Some keywords. We need to identify one food chain with 4 trophic levels. Now, if we can recall what trophic levels mean, trophic levels refer to the feeding levels or the organisms occupying the different levels in a food chain. So if we look at this food web, there's several that we could identify. So we've got to identify a food chain with 4 trophic levels. Right, so here we have our producers being the lettuce, grass, and we've got grain. And these are different producers that are producing food by the process of photosynthesis. If we were to identify the second trophic level that feeds off lettuce, we would identify the snail. So the snail is an organism that feeds off the first trophic level. So we'll call this the first trophic level. Okay, the snail being the second trophic level, and the thrush birds are the third trophic level, and the hawk that feeds off these birds would be the fourth trophic level. So if I were to illustrate this in a diagrammatic form, I'd obviously write down lettuce, an arrow indicating the second trophic level, that'll be the snail. The next trophic level would be the thrush birds, and finally the fourth trophic level would be the hawk. Okay, so I'm going to call this the first trophic level, the second trophic level, the third trophic level, and the fourth trophic level. So that's one of many food chains that we could identify. I'm going to challenge you guys to identify the next one. I'm going to play around, I'm going to change the color of my pen and try and identify another food chain with 4 trophic levels. So I'm going to look at grass as being 1. Rabbits feed off grass, so this would be the first trophic level. The rabbit would be the second trophic level. If we go on, oh no, we're not going to get 3 here. We're only going to get 3 here. So that's not going to answer the question. Let's look at an alternative. Okay, let's take that out. Right, let's see, before we get down to this. So if we look at, okay, interesting. So we've got grain, we've got mouse, we've got, right, there's one that we've identified. So here's the second one with 4 trophic levels. We've got grain, we've got a mouse that feeds off the grain, we've got a snake that feeds off the mouse, and obviously we've got the owl that could feed off the snake. And here we've got 4 different trophic levels in the same food web. So we could call that, the second example would be grain. That'll be the first trophic level. The next would be the mouse. The next would be, if we let's scroll up there, and that was the snake. And The fourth trophic level would be the owl. So in this food chain, we've got the grain, which would be the producers, produced by the wheat plant, the mouse being the primary consumer, the second trophic level, the snake being the secondary consumer on the third trophic level, and we have the owl being the tertiary consumer on the fourth trophic level. So if we go back to the question and we look at that question again, so we've got to identify one food chain with 4 trophic levels, and this is a 2-mark question. So we've identified the food chain, we've identified 2 possible answers. Here we've looked at one as, and that would give us 1 mark there, and obviously for labeling the different levels, another mark. Very good. I hope you guys got those. Let's move on to the next question. Right, so we're referring to the same food web again. Give the name of one organism that is found in the trophic level containing the most energy. So essentially, guys, which would be the organisms that which would be the level that contains the most energy? Think about this before you answer. Yes, it would be your primary, your producers here, your autotrophs. If we think about the amount of plants available in relation to the number of animals available, we have much more plants or autotrophs than herbivores or your secondary or tertiary consumers, and hence the most amount of energy available in any ecosystem would be the producers, and in this case the answer would be the producers, which would be the lettuce, grass, and grain. Okay. Right, let's move on to the next. We're still referring to the same food chain, food web. The next question. Identify one carnivore from the food web above. If we go back to what we did earlier on, we looked at herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. So what is a carnivore, guys? Yes, a carnivore is an organism that feeds exclusively on meat. So let's look at this food web and identify an organism that feeds exclusively on meat. Right, so it's going to be a hawk. Yes, feeds exclusively on thrush. It feeds off rabbits, it feeds off the finch birds. Snakes as well. Carnivorous, they feed off mouse, and yeah, sometimes you'd find snake feeding off rabbits as well. And if we look at our owls, they also feed off mice, they feed off snakes, and hence we have 3 possible answers for this, which all would be correct. So we would be correct if we said hawks, we would be correct if we said snake, and we would be correct if we said the owl as well. The next question. Ty, do we have some questions coming in?
So far, they're trickling in, but they're coming, which I usually just kind of put to pretty much they're just watching and paying attention. But now I'm also thinking we might need to take a quick ad break. What do you think?
Let's go for that ad break, guys. And if you've got some questions, we'll take them after the break.
All right. So Mindsetters, as Eugen said, make sure you get your questions in so we can get to them in this last segment. But on that note, Mindsetters, we'll see you after this break. And welcome back, Mindsetters. I hope you had a nice little break there and you went and did whatever you had to do. But now you need to come back with us and focus and pay attention. But before we actually continue, you're going to actually have some questions here that came up earlier. So let me just get it up here. Yes, we had a question from Tiamo. Tiamo wanted to find out what is the bacteria that might occur at the root nodules of legumes. Please help.
Good question, Tiamo. The scientific name for that, there are many bacteria that live in the nodules of them, but we can often refer to them as denitrifying bacteria as a general term. But these bacteria have specific names, which at the moment I may not be able to give you, but we generally refer to bacteria that live in the nodules of leguminous plants as denitrifying bacteria. Nice question. We'll take a few more questions from Ty. If not, we're going to get back to the questions that I've prepared for you.
So far, we do have a couple of questions, but I'm not sure if they pertain to the actual subject matter right now.
Right, guys. I'm hoping that you guys are going to send me some questions related to what we've done already. And if there's something that's related, Ty's he's gonna send those questions to me, and then I'm gonna respond to them. But in the meantime, let's continue with what I've prepared for you guys today. Right. So getting back to the food web. Okay. So decomposers are not shown in this food chain, but they play a key part in any. They play a key role. They play a key part in any ecosystem. We discussed the importance of bacteria and decomposers already. Let's look at 2 examples of decomposers that we have. So the first example, examples of decomposers would be, one example would be bacteria, another would be fungi, and we refer to both of them as sapro. We said that these are saprophytes, and they're capable of breaking down organic material and returning the inorganic nutrients back into the soil. So the question again, name 2 examples of decomposers in a ecosystem. When you say that bacteria and fungi play a very important role in decomposition. Let's move on to the next question. Right, so the question again relating to decomposers. Explain why, and that's important, decomposers play an important role in an ecosystem. Very nice question. Relates to what we've done already. Let's extend the page, guys. And we said that when organisms die, dead organic matter. What happens to the plant material, the animals that die, that needs to decompose? Through the facilitation of bacteria and fungi that contain enzymes, these dead organic material will decompose. So bacteria and fungi contain enzymes. And these enzymes would break down. They would break down organic material and then return the nutrients and break down organic matter into inorganic nutrients, and that returns back into the soil. And what I've drawn here, guys, if you'd notice, would be the nutrient cycle, which we've done already. So let's go back to the question. Explain why decomposers play an important role in an ecosystem. We looked at the functions of bacteria in an ecosystem, and we said that the decomposers, both bacteria and fungi, contain enzymes, and they break down organic material and they return that back into the soil, and they ensure that the nutrient cycle returns the nutrients back into the soil. Right. Okay. We're still looking at these food webs. The next question. If all the thrush died, what would happen? What would happen to the number of snails? Explain your answer. And this is a 3-mark question. Remember, guys, we need to always look at the number of marks being allocated to a question so we could understand the depth or the length of our answer that we need to respond with. So again, if all the thrush in this food chain died out, so if we remove them from the food chain, what would happen to the number of snails in this ecosystem? Very interesting question. So let's extend this page a bit, guys, and let's see what happens. So if we were to take out all the thrush from this ecosystem, we've got to look at what's feeding, what the thrush fed on. So the thrush would feed on snails, and if we were to eliminate the thrush from, let's move this back there, guys. Okay. Interesting. Sorry. Right. So if we were to take out thrush from this ecosystem, the snail population would increase. So the number of snails in this, there would be no natural predators to the snails, so the snail population numbers would increase, and that would mean that the food that the snails feed on, the lettuce, this would decrease. And if the lettuce population decreased, or the amount of vegetation available, and if it was reduced, rabbits would also be affected, although they have alternative sources of food, but they would then tend to put pressure on grass, and hence they would eat up the grass. And hence we need to have alternative sources of energy. So the question again would be, if all the thrush died, what would happen to the number of snails in that? Explain your answer. So the number of snails would increase, the snail population would increase, and what would be the effect of an increase in snail population? Yes, it would, the lettuce or the producers would decrease. Producers decrease. And why? It's because that there are too many snails, and they need to sustain their energy requirements, and they'd destroy most of the lettuce available, and that in turn would affect other organisms. Okay. And finally, we come to a very interesting question, and this is about the use of pesticides in agriculture. A farmer decided to use pesticides to kill mice, as they are pests that were destroying all his grain. What impact would this have on the food web? Suggest alternatives that the farmer could consider. If we looked at this food web and we said that the mice were eliminated because the farmer used pesticide, we would then need to look at the impact that reducing or removal of mice from that population. Firstly, the mice are a source of food for snakes and the owls. So if we take the mice out of this population, the snakes population would be affected. We firstly would need to then look at what would they consume next? There needs to be a source of food for them. So if we remove the mouse from that area, we're going to find that the snakes would definitely, population would decrease. And we need snakes because they are the natural predators for mice, and they control the number of snakes, a number of mice in the wild. The owl population would decrease, and we need owls because they play a very important role as natural predators to mice and many rodents. So what advice would you give the farmer? I would suggest that we need to look at alternatives. The alternatives would be introduce more owls into that area. As owls being a natural predator, they would try and control the population, and this has been done in many areas where they've used owls to control the mice population. Okay, that's an interesting question. And finally, what will happen to this community if a veld fire were to remove all the grass? Again, if we had a veld fire and that removed all the grass, it would directly affect the impala and zebras, as these organisms rely on the grass for their food. These organisms in turn, their numbers would decrease, and as their numbers decrease, they would affect the lion population as well as probably the cheetah population as well. So we've come to the end of ecology, the biotic components today. You've got to remember that food chains are not isolated. They need to interact with food webs. We looked at the relationship between different trophic levels, and we understand how important it is for organisms to interact with the environment and each other. So guys, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to hand you over to Ty, and then I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again next week.
All right, so before we actually wrap, I actually have some questions that finally did pop up. So I've been collecting them. So I've got a couple here. One is from Nolo. I wanted to find out some of the energy transferred from the herbivore to the carnivore will be used up by the carnivore. So what percentage of the energy will be stored in the carnivore's body?
Well, if we look at the movement of energy from one trophic level to the next, it's quite random that I'm going to be able to use 10%. If 10% of the food was available from the producer to the consumer, I would say that it would be 8% or less. So the amount of energy available to the carnivore would be much less.
All right. Okay, so I think that was basically one of the main ones that kind of was coming up there. So just the difference between consumers and producers. But thank you for that. And on that note, Mindsetters, I hope you had a great session today. And make sure that you guys keep using the page, chat to us, let us know what you think. But for me, I'll see you next time.